The chandeliers of Buckingham Palace glittered like 1,000 frozen stars that evening. Golden light spilled across the grand hall, where velvet drapes and polished silver created an atmosphere of royal splendor. All eyes inevitably drifted toward Queen Camilla, radiant in a gown of deep emerald silk, every inch of her poised to project authority and grace. But then silence snapped into the air like glass shattering. A sudden stumble, the faint clatter of cutlery, and a gasp rising from the crowd. Little Princess Charlotte, no more than a child at play, had darted too close to the table. Her small elbow brushed against a crystal stem, and in a heartbeat, a goblet of red wine toppled, its contents cascading down the folds of Camilla's pristine dress. The hall froze. Guests stiffened, their expressions locked somewhere between horror and disbelief. Camilla's face drained of color before flooding with sharp indignation. King Charles shifted uneasily, caught between his wife's searing glare and his granddaughter's trembling innocence. Across the table, William's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as Catherine reached for his hand beneath the tablecloth, a silent gesture urging restraint. What should have been nothing more than a child's harmless accident now pulsed through the room like a thunderclap. A single spill, a single stain, yet beneath it lay the raw nerves of history, pride, and power. Was this truly just a child's mistake? Or the spark that would ignite a storm of hidden rivalries inside the royal family? Did Camilla simply lose her composure? Or was this her moment to assert dominance in front of the entire dynasty? The night that began as a celebration was about to unravel into something far darker. The chandeliers of Buckingham Palace glistened like 1,000 captured stars. Their golden glow spilled across the grand dining hall, illuminating polished silverware and crystal glasses arranged with mathematical precision. The air was heavy with the scent of roses and aged wine, an intoxicating mixture of luxury and tradition. That night, September 15th, 2025, was not merely a dinner, it was a spectacle, a performance of royal power staged for the eyes of both Britain's elite and the foreign dignitaries who had been granted the rare honor of dining with the House of Windsor. At the very heart of the room, seated beside King Charles, was Queen Consort Camilla, draped in a gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered under candlelight. She radiated authority. The fabric hugged her frame with calculated elegance, and on her wrist glittered a bracelet once belonging to the late Queen Elizabeth, a silent declaration of her new place in the hierarchy. Guests watched her with a mix of awe and unease. For every admiring whisper about her commanding presence, there was a hushed aside about the controversies that had trailed her for decades. Charles, ever the monarch struggling to balance duty with personal weakness, maintained a stiff composure. He smiled, nodded, raised his glass when necessary, but behind his eyes flickered the constant anxiety of a man who knew his wife's temper could ignite at any moment. He had lived too long with the scars of scandal not to anticipate fresh ones. On the opposite side of the table sat Prince William and Princess Catherine. William's expression was carved in stone, jaw tight, his eyes darting between his father and Camilla as though waiting for a storm he knew would inevitably break. Catherine, poised as always, softened the scene with her warmth, exchanging polite pleasantries with the guests around her. Though beneath the table her hand tightened over William's, a silent tether to keep him steady. And then there was Charlotte, the little princess, oblivious to the tension that hung like smoke over the adults, skipped around the edges of the table. Her laughter bubbled like champagne, a sound of innocence piercing through the carefully orchestrated seriousness of the evening. Guests smiled indulgently, some whispering about how much she resembled her grandmother Diana. The same spark in the eyes, the same uncontainable energy. Camilla's gaze, however, flickered with irritation every time Charlotte circled too close. It was subtle but sharp, an arch of the brow, a tightening of the lips. For a woman who had spent years fighting for legitimacy, the antics of a child disrupting the grandeur of her moment felt like sand thrown in polished gears. The orchestra played softly in the background, violins weaving a delicate thread of music through the hall. The waiters glided like shadows, pouring fine Bordeaux into crystal glasses. And it was that glass of wine, a detail so minor in the grand theater of the evening, that would soon become the spark to ignite chaos. Charlotte, in her playful rush, brushed past the corner of the table. Her little hand clipped the stem of a glass balanced precariously close to the edge. Time slowed, the crimson liquid tipped, then cascaded downward in a scarlet arc, splashing across the emerald silk of Camilla's gown. A collective gasp tore through the hall. The sound of music faltered, as if even the orchestra could not continue. The red spread like wildfire across Camilla's lap, staining the perfection of her attire with brutal clarity. Camilla froze. For a heartbeat. She was a statue, her chest unmoving, her eyes wide. Then, like a mask cracking, fury surged through her expression, her face flushed, jaw clenched, eyes narrowing into icy slits. Guests exchanged nervous glances. No one dared move. It was as though the entire room had been trapped in glass, brittle and breakable. Charles reacted first, or rather, tried to. He reached for his napkin with trembling hands, dabbing uselessly at the spreading stain. "It's nothing, nothing at all," he stammered, forcing a brittle laugh, but his voice betrayed him. There was a quiver, a hollow echo of panic. He knew his wife well enough to fear what came next. William's eyes darkened, his body stiffening in his chair. His gaze flicked to Camilla, then to his daughter, who now stood frozen in shock, her small hands clasped at her chest, tears welling in her eyes. Catherine immediately rose, stepping toward Charlotte, pulling her close with a protective arm, and then Camilla stood. She rose with a swiftness that sent her chair screeching back across the polished floor. All eyes locked on her. The emerald silk of her dress clung heavy with wine, a grotesque bloom of red spreading across her lap like blood on velvet. Her voice, when it came, was low but razor sharp. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The words sliced through the silence. Though directed at a child, they carried the weight of authority, anger, and humiliation. Charlotte whimpered softly, burying her face into her mother's dress. Catherine tightened her hold, her eyes flashing with barely contained fury. William's fists clenched under the table. Charles forced another laugh, his tone pleading. "It was an accident. Camilla, children, these things happen." But his attempt at smoothing the moment only highlighted the crack forming in the room's fragile facade. The guests remained frozen, caught between horror and fascination. To witness a royal scandal unfold live was both terrifying and irresistible. Camilla's hands shook as she lifted her skirt slightly, glaring at the ruin. She turned her eyes back to Charlotte, and for a chilling instant, there was nothing grandmotherly or tender in her expression. Only cold rage. The silence pressed tighter. The chandeliers seemed to burn brighter, casting harsh light across the scene. And in that suffocating stillness, one truth became undeniable. The evening had shifted. A simple accident had detonated into something far greater, something that could not be undone. The crimson stain spread like wildfire across Camilla's silk gown, the deep red wine seeping into every shimmering fold. For a split second, the royal banquet hall froze in time. The string quartet faltered mid-note, crystal glasses trembled in half-raised hands, and 100 eyes darted toward the queen consort. Camilla's face, usually an iron mask of regal poise, cracked open with a raw flash of fury. She jerked back from the table, her chair screeching against the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the room, as though the walls themselves were recoiling from the scene. "How dare you?" Camilla's voice thundered, so loud it silenced even the chandeliers that still tinkled faintly from the sudden jolt. She towered above the small figure of Princess Charlotte, who stood frozen near the edge of the table, her little hands trembling as if she were trying to rewind time and snatch the glass from the air before it spilled. Charlotte's wide blue eyes glistened, and she bit her lip, torn between confusion and fear. She was, after all, just a child, innocent, restless, swept up in the energy of the grand celebration. But to Camilla, this was no childish accident. It was an unforgivable humiliation. Camilla jabbed a finger toward the girl, her diamond ring flashing under the golden chandeliers. You have no sense of decorum, no discipline. Is this how the future princess of this kingdom is raised? Like a wild thing, with no respect for her elders? The words sliced through the hall like shards of glass. Some guests looked away in discomfort. Others stared with morbid fascination. But the loudest reaction came not from the guests, but from the girl's parents. Enough! Wow, Prince William's chair scraped harshly as he rose to his feet. His towering figure cast a protective shadow over his daughter. Beside him, Catherine's hand instinctively reached for Charlotte's, pulling her close against her mother's side. Catherine's face was pale but resolute, her jaw set, her eyes fixed coldly on Camilla. She's a child, Catherine said, her voice measured but laced with steel. And she meant no harm. Camilla turned her gaze to Catherine, and for a moment the tension between the two women threatened to swallow the room whole. No harm? Camilla spat, her voice dripping with disdain. She lifted the hem of her ruined gown, the wine spreading like a bruise across the expensive fabric. Do you realize what you've allowed? This is not about a dress. It is about respect, about discipline. A child raised without boundaries grows into an adult without shame. William's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. He could feel every gaze in the room pressing down on him, waiting for his response. But his anger was not about appearances. It was about his daughter, his flesh and blood, being humiliated publicly by the woman who had already taken so much from his family's history. My daughter owes you no apology, William said, his voice low but dangerous. If you cannot show her the kindness of a grandmother, then at least show her the decency of silence. The air thickened, almost suffocating. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the clink of cutlery replaced by a heavy, unnatural hush. Somewhere at the far end of the table, a candle sputtered and went out, as if in solidarity with the child who now pressed her face against Catherine's gown, trying to disappear. William, please. Charles finally broke his silence, his voice a strained whisper. The king rose halfway from his chair, torn between his son and his wife. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted them in a pleading gesture. This is a family matter. Let us not turn this evening into a spectacle. But it was far too late. The spectacle had already begun. Camilla spun toward Charles, her eyes flashing. A spectacle? Do you call this respect? Your son standing against your wife. Your grandchild running wild through the royal banquet like it's a playground. And I am the one who must hold my tongue. Charles closed his eyes briefly, exhaustion etching deep lines into his face. He had endured decades of scandals, whispers, and betrayals. But this moment cut deeper, because it was not a battle with the press or parliament. It was a battle within his own family, unfolding in front of dignitaries and allies. Catherine pulled Charlotte closer, bending down just enough to whisper soothing words into her ear, but her eyes never left Camilla's. They were cold, unyielding, a silent declaration that she would not allow her daughter to be scapegoated. Then, like the sudden crack of thunder, another voice joined the storm. Camilla! The single word carried more weight than a dozen shouted accusations. Princess Anne, regal and sharp as ever, had risen from her seat at the far side of the table. Her expression was carved from stone, her eyes piercing as she fixed them on her brother's wife. That is enough. Camilla's chest heaved, but she faltered under Anne's gaze. The room shifted again, guests turning now to the Princess Royal, who had always been the family's steadiest anchor. She is a child, Anne continued, her voice clear and unwavering. And children make mistakes. That is the nature of innocence. If you cannot forgive that, then perhaps you should ask yourself what role you are truly meant to play in this family. A hush fell over the hall, heavier than before. Camilla's lips parted, as though to respond, but no words came. The weight of Anne's rebuke hung in the air, undeniable, unshakable. Charles looked from his sister to his wife, his expression caught between despair and anger. The king's shoulders sagged. the crown invisible, yet unbearably heavy. He longed for peace, but peace was slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. William placed a steadying hand on his daughter's shoulder. His voice, though low, carried clearly enough for the room to hear. This is not about wine. It is not about fabric. It is about compassion. And tonight it is in short supply. Catherine's hand tightened around Charlotte's, her other arm wrapping protectively around the girl's small frame. In her silence, she spoke louder than any words. A mother's shield, unbreakable, unyielding. The banquet that had begun as a celebration now felt like a battlefield. Invisible lines had been drawn, sides quietly chosen. Some guests glanced sympathetically toward William and Catherine. Others shifted nervously toward Camilla, unwilling to risk her wrath. And in the center, Charles stood alone, a man torn between love, duty, and regret. Camilla's voice finally returned, though softer now, edged with bitterness. "So this is how it will be," she murmured. "A queen mocked in her own hall, a woman disrespected in front of the world. Very well, Mus. But remember this moment." Her words were not a concession. They were a warning. Anne's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing further. William exhaled slowly, as though releasing years of pent-up fury. Catherine guided Charlotte toward the exit, each step echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. And Charles, helpless in the eye of the storm, could only lower his head. The chandeliers flickered overhead, as though struggling to keep their light in the suffocating darkness that had fallen upon Buckingham Palace. And in that silence, broken only by the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain, the family fracture became undeniable, exposed not just to themselves but to every witness present that night. For in Camilla's wrath, the monarchy had revealed its deepest wound, and yet this was only the beginning. But the true shock of the evening was not simply Camilla's fury. It was the way each member of the royal family chose their side, setting the stage for a conflict that would shake the very foundations of Buckingham Palace. The atmosphere in the royal dining hall remained heavy long after Camilla's furious outburst. What should have been a carefully orchestrated banquet, meant to showcase unity and refinement, had instead devolved into a battlefield of suppressed emotions and simmering hostilities. Every guest could sense it. Every member of the family felt it. The invisible fracture lines within the monarchy had just deepened before their very eyes. William and Catherine were the first to respond to Camilla's aggression, and they did so with a swiftness that surprised even seasoned observers. Catherine, usually the embodiment of composure, had tightened her grip on her daughter's hand, her eyes fixed on Camilla with a gaze colder than marble. It was not just the look of a mother protecting her child. It was a warning shot, a declaration that there were limits, and Camilla had just crossed one. William, too, rose to his feet, his tone firm, his words deliberate. "This is not acceptable." The message was clear. They were not going to allow their child to become collateral damage in Camilla's battle for dominance. For Camilla, the resistance only fueled her rage. To her, William's reaction was nothing short of insolence. She raised her voice further, making it unmistakably clear to every guest that she was not prepared to back down. In her mind, she was the queen consort, a position she had fought to legitimize through decades of scandal, criticism, and humiliation. To be challenged, especially by her husband's son, was an insult that cut deep. The more Charles attempted to soothe her, the more she interpreted his interventions as weakness, even betrayal. Anne's intervention, however, was the true spark that turned private hostility into public confrontation. Her words were brief but devastating. "It's just a child," Camilla delivered with a tone of icy disdain. They carried far more weight than a simple defense of her niece. They represented a clear alignment. Anne had chosen her side, and she had chosen it openly, against Camilla. For years, Anne had maintained a careful distance from the dramas of Charles's marriage, preferring to operate in her own lane, focused on her charitable work and military duties. But her patience with Camilla had always been limited. In Anne's eyes, Diana had been treated with cruelty, and Camilla's ascension to the role of queen consort had always been a bitter pill to swallow. By stepping in now, Anne was no longer just protecting a child, she was making a political statement. The division in the family became glaringly obvious. On one side stood William, Catherine, and Anne, forming an unspoken coalition, united by instinct and by principle. On the other stood Camilla, isolated but defiant, her anger boiling into something raw and unrestrained. Charles, meanwhile, found himself paralyzed, caught between his wife and his heir. Every word he might utter risked alienating one side or deepening the chasm between them. His silence, though intended as diplomacy, came across as weakness. The guests present, political figures, aristocrats, foreign dignitaries, watched with thinly veiled shock. They had come expecting a spectacle of elegance, but instead they were witnessing the monarchy's most private fault lines exposed in real time. Some exchanged nervous glances, others whispered behind raised hands. The grandeur of the setting only amplified the humiliation. And then came the comparisons. It was inevitable. Quiet murmurs among the guests began to circle back to Diana. Memories of her warmth, her grace, her ability to charm with a smile, resurfaced in contrast to the venom dripping from Camilla's words. Where Diana had once absorbed public scrutiny with dignity, Camilla seemed to amplify it with her temper. Where Diana had been the people's princess, Camilla now appeared to be the people's problem. The moment lingered, stretching uncomfortably as no one dared to resume their meal. The clinking of cutlery had stopped, the soft hum of conversation replaced by a suffocating silence. The tension was palpable. Even the youngest members of the family, though shielded as best they could be, understood that something irreversible had just occurred. Behind the scenes, whispers already began to swirl. Staff exchanged uneasy looks, sensing the storm that was about to break beyond the palace walls. For the royal household, scandal was nothing new, but this was different. This was not a tabloid rumor or an unverified photograph. This was a public scene, witnessed by dozens of high-ranking individuals who would carry the story into their own circles of influence. And once it reached the press, as it inevitably would, it would ignite a firestorm. Camilla's fury did not subside easily. Even as the banquet limped on Shemaino, she continued to cast sharp remarks, her voice dripping with contempt. She spoke of respect, of discipline, of the proper order of things. But the more she tried to assert her authority, the more obvious it became that she was isolated. Catherine remained unyielding, her composure intact, but her defiance unmistakable. William's silence was thunderous, his stance beside his wife a symbol of unity. Anne, arms crossed, wore an expression that left no doubt as to where her loyalties lay. Charles's attempts to redirect the evening, raising a toast, shifting the topic, even forcing a strained smile, only highlighted the fracture. The damage was done. What had begun as an argument over a child's behavior had metastasized into a full-blown struggle for power, legitimacy, and the future direction of the monarchy. The symbolism was hard to ignore. In the eyes of many, this was no longer just about Camilla's temper. It was about Diana's ghost. It was about the legacy of a woman who, even decades after her death, still cast a long shadow over the Windsor family. Every cruel word from Camilla seemed to remind the public of what Diana had endured. Every defensive stance from William and Catherine seemed to echo Diana's spirit, as if her memory was alive through them. By the time the banquet concluded, the royal family's divisions were impossible to hide. Guests departed with whispers on their lips, phones buzzing discreetly as they relayed what they had seen to confidants and colleagues. Within hours, the first leaks began to surface in the press. Anonymous sources spoke of a tense confrontation, of raised voices, of a shocking display of discord within the royal family. And so, as dawn approached the next day, the monarchy braced itself for impact. The headlines were brutal. Camilla was painted as unhinged, cruel, incapable of grace. Comparisons to Diana flooded social media, with hashtags lamenting the state of the monarchy. The narrative was no longer confined to the palace. It belonged to the world. Inside the royal walls, the fallout was immediate. Charles called for private meetings, desperate to contain the damage. Camilla, however, refused to acknowledge any fault, convinced that she had been undermined, even betrayed, by her own family. William and Catherine held their ground, unwilling to apologize or soften their stance. Anne, true to form, made no attempt to conceal her contempt. The stage was set. The monarchy, already fragile under the weight of public scrutiny, now faced a scandal that had originated not from external gossip, but from its own dining table. The fracture was not a rumor. It was real, undeniable, and dangerously visible. And yet, as the dust began to settle, one thing became painfully clear. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. And when the public outside the palace walls learned of the incident, the storm had only just begun. The British royal family has weathered countless storms over the centuries, but few scandals in recent memory have ignited as much fury as what unfolded during a recent royal banquet. What should have been a glittering evening of diplomacy and tradition instead erupted into a public relations nightmare. Reports quickly spread that Queen Camilla, in a shocking loss of composure, lashed out at a young princess in front of guests. Within hours, the press had their headline, "Camilla loses temper with the little princess during royal dinner." The story went viral instantly. Cameras had not caught the exact moment, but whispers from the banquet hall began to leak. Several attendees, speaking on condition of anonymity, described an uncomfortable silence falling over the room after Camilla's sharp tone. Some said the child appeared visibly upset, while others claimed Charles attempted to downplay the scene. The details remain murky, but the damage was already done. For Camilla, this was more than just a slip. It was a defining moment that cast her in a deeply unflattering light. Public reaction was swift and merciless. Across Britain, people drew immediate comparisons to the late Princess Diana, who had built her legacy on compassion, kindness, and a special ability to connect with children. Social media exploded with posts that juxtaposed Diana's warmth with Camilla's alleged harshness. "Diana would have never," one viral comment read, racking up tens of thousands of likes. Newspapers published scathing editorials, describing Camilla as cold, impatient, and unfit to embody the soft power expected of a queen consort. What made matters worse was that details kept trickling out. A handful of banquet guests spoke to tabloids, describing an atmosphere of tension not just during the incident, but throughout the evening. According to one report, even before the confrontation, Camilla had seemed visibly irritated, her smile strained, her exchanges with family members clipped and formal. Another guest claimed Prince William had been particularly frosty toward both his stepmother and father, barely engaging in small talk. Catherine, meanwhile, was said to have kept her distance entirely, avoiding direct interaction with Camilla. These whispers fueled the narrative that the family's fractures, long hidden behind palace walls, were now spilling out for all the world to see. For years, Camilla has struggled to win over the British public. Though time has softened some of the outrage surrounding her role in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, she has never fully escaped the shadow of that scandal. The image of the other woman lingers, and moments like this banquet fiasco only reinforce old prejudices. Critics argue that no matter how many charitable initiatives she supports, no matter how many official duties she fulfills, Camilla will always lack Diana's natural charisma. The banquet incident seemed to crystallize that belief for many. Within the palace, the fallout was no less severe. King Charles, already weakened by health struggles, is said to be deeply troubled by the controversy. Sources close to the monarchy report that he has been desperately trying to mediate between his wife and his son, but with little success. William, according to insiders, is furious that the family's reputation is once again tarnished, this time by Camilla's temper. He has reportedly grown cold and distant toward his father, while Catherine has gone further, deliberately avoiding Camilla altogether in recent weeks. Their absence at joint appearances has not gone unnoticed by the press, who are quick to highlight the widening gulf within the House of Windsor. The king's attempts to smooth things over have only made matters worse. Statements issued by palace spokespeople, designed to minimize the incident, came across as dismissive and insincere. Instead of calming the storm, They fueled further speculation that the monarchy was trying to hide the truth. As one commentator on the BBC bluntly put it, if this is how they handle a scandal about a family dinner, what else might they be covering up? This crisis comes at a particularly fragile time for the monarchy. Charles's declining health raises pressing questions about succession. Many royal watchers argue that William and Catherine are already carrying the weight of the monarchy's future on their shoulders. Every misstep by Camilla only adds urgency to the calls for a generational shift in leadership. Yet Charles remains steadfast in defending his wife, a stance that only deepens the rift with his eldest son. The implications extend far beyond family drama. The monarchy depends on public support for its very survival. Polls in recent years have shown fluctuating approval ratings, with younger generations increasingly indifferent or outright hostile to the idea of a monarchy. Scandals like this banquet outburst accelerate that decline. Critics argue that the monarchy cannot afford another public relations disaster tied to Camilla, while supporters counter that the public is too quick to judge without knowing the full story. Either way, the damage to Camilla's image is undeniable. Meanwhile, the press shows no signs of letting the story go. Headlines continue to dissect the banquet outburst, while opinion pieces speculate about its long-term consequences. Some frame it as a minor embarrassment blown out of proportion. Others see it as symbolic of deeper dysfunction within the royal household. Conspiracy theories swirl online, with some claiming that palace insiders deliberately leaked the story to weaken Camilla's standing. Whether true or not, the effect is the same. Her credibility has taken a serious hit. For Charles, the banquet scandal underscores the near-impossible balancing act he faces. He must protect his wife, maintain unity within his family, and preserve the dignity of the crown, all while battling illness and preparing for the inevitable transition of power. The stress is said to be taking a toll, with close aides describing the king as exhausted and demoralized. Yet his determination to shield Camilla remains unwavering, even at the cost of further alienating William and Catherine. All of this leads to a single haunting question echoing across Britain. Has Camilla become a liability to the monarchy? For her supporters, she is a steady hand, unfairly vilified by a public still clinging to the memory of Diana. For her detractors, she is the embodiment of everything the monarchy should not be: cold, calculating, and out of touch. And for the nation, the uncertainty surrounding her role only adds to the growing sense that the House of Windsor is approaching a crossroads. In the end, one thing is clear: the banquet incident was not just a fleeting embarrassment. It has exposed deep fissures within the royal family, reignited old grudges, and forced the nation to question once again the stability of its monarchy. And so the debate continues, with voices on both sides growing louder by the day. And all of it leads to the one question that has the entire United Kingdom talking. What comes next for the crown? Was the shocking banquet incident nothing more than a fleeting moment of temper, a childish accident blown out of proportion? Or was it something far more calculated, a deliberate display of authority from Queen Camilla meant to remind everyone of her place at the royal table? The public remains bitterly divided. On one side are those who argue that Camilla simply lost her patience for a second, that her reaction was no different from what any adult might do under the strain of stress and scrutiny. To them, the story is overblown, a storm manufactured by tabloids hungry for scandal. But on the other side are voices that insist this was not an accident at all. They believe Camilla's sharp response revealed her true nature, an iron will and an unyielding ambition that she has carefully masked for years. In their eyes, the outburst was not about a child at all, but about power, control, and dominance within the royal household. And that is precisely why this moment matters. The spilled wine glass may seem trivial, but in the grand narrative of the monarchy, it could very well be the drop that overflows the glass. It exposes cracks that have been quietly spreading behind palace walls, cracks of resentment, mistrust, and rivalries too deep to ignore, which leaves us with a haunting question. In a family celebrated as the very embodiment of nobility, could such ordinary human conflicts threaten the stability of the crown itself? And more importantly, when the dust settles, Whose side will the public choose in this silent yet ferocious battle for influence?